Hello, everybody. This is Dr. E, and today I'm going to be talking to you about solution focused therapy skills. Here's a brief agenda for our time today. First, we'll discuss SFT skills overview, including problem free talk, its future focus, and editorial reflections. Next, we'll review the importance of open ended questions to SFT, and I'll also share with you some common session starters. Next, we'll explore the questions that support change and the questions that are really associated with SFT, including scaling, coping, exception, identity, and strategy questions, along with the tomorrow question, which you may know as the miracle question. So, let's have a quick review of SFT. This intervention was developed by Steve DeShazar and his wife, Insoo Kim Berg, along with a few others at the Milwaukee Family Therapy Center in the 1960s. What marks SFT's difference from many other kinds of psychotherapy is its approach to what's called problem free talk. And this means that the therapist explicitly does not solicit what's wrong, but what is going well, what's going right. And by keeping the focus on solutions rather than getting bogged down in problems, the developers believed that clients could be helped to get resolution to their problems more quickly than by exploring their problems in depth. So, the key idea of SFT is that the therapist and the client work together to develop short term goals that are very relevant to the client, that are concrete, specific, achievable, very small, and actionable, and that represent new behaviors for the client. SFT's orientation sees people as creating future focused narratives or visions for themselves that are not problem focused. In SFT, the therapist and the client construct ideas that would resolve the client's problems. So the therapist will ask questions designed to help the client achieve or explore resolutions to the problems that exist. The tomorrow question, formerly the miracle question, is arguably the most famous of the SFT questions, and it's really central to SFT. SFT also focuses on and relies on open ended questions that begin with who, what, how, where, when. However, not the why of goal attainment. SFT therapists aren't particularly interested in why things happened or why a client might have acted in the way that they did. So those who, what, when, how, and where questions are really designed to get the client thinking about solutions, options, and alternatives that will move them out of their current situation and into a future that's more agreeable. Another way that SFT veers away from conventional psychotherapy is what's called the editorial reflection, or sometimes called a thinking pause. When toward the end of the session, the therapist might say, let's take a few minutes and think quietly about what you've said, and then you can share with me what you've taken away from this, and I'll share with you what I see. In really orthodox SFT, the therapist leaves the room and goes and consults with another therapist about the case. That's not seen so often anymore. The client and the therapist would probably now just sit quietly for a minute or two, each thinking, and then the therapist will invite the client to share their key takeaways. And the therapist will, at that point, give the client a specific compliment about something that they noticed the client doing well throughout the session. This can't be just a generic compliment that isn't personal to the client. So something like, "Oh, you're doing a great job taking care of yourself," isn't sufficiently specific for a compliment. The therapist should be able to point to something unique to the client, such as, "I see that you are really persistent in trying to achieve your goal." Something that will speak to the client and let the client know that the therapist was listening. It's also important for the therapist to acknowledge the difficulty that the client is experiencing. This is because throughout the session, as the client begins to really focus on their problems over and over and over again, the therapist tries to steer them away from the problem into problem-free talk. So at the end of the session, acknowledging that, yes, the client is indeed struggling with significant issues, uh, reassures the client that the therapist acknowledges and agrees that the things that they're struggling with are significant and real. And then the therapist offers encouragement and support and belief that the client will be able to overcome their troubles. Each SFT session is presumed potentially to be the last one. There isn't the expectation in SFT that the client will see you every week. So the session often ends with the therapist inquiring whether the client would like to make another appointment. And if they do want to make another appointment, it's typically scheduled for at least a few weeks out. So the client has an opportunity to act on some of the new ideas that were generated during the session. So, as I've said, open-ended questions are especially important in SFT. They're really part of the secret sauce of this modality. And questions that begin with what and who and when and how and where are the way to formulate those questions. You may also invite conversation with something like, "Tell me about," asking about a future focused hope. For instance, "Tell me what your vision is for the way that your marriage might work out best," would be a good tell me question. Questions that begin with can, did, will, are, does, have, those are all closed-ended questions. They can be answered with a yes or a no. And as a result, they're weaker questions. That's true for all different kinds of therapy, but especially true in solution-focused therapy, which depends upon open-ended questions. Here are some examples of closed to open-ended questions. Closed-ended question: do you feel upset? That can be open to, how do you feel? Notice the closed-ended question, was she late to the appointment? It's binary, yes or no. You can open that up with, what time did she arrive? Could you have handled it a different way? Closed-ended question. How else could you have handled it? Invites conversation, and so on. These are important skills to practice as you're getting ready to develop solution focused therapy skills. Challenge yourself to ask one question at a time and ensure that it is an open-ended, future focused, problem free question. SFT sessions often begin with what are known as session starters. Examples of these are, what's your best hope for our time together today? What's been better during the past few days? Notice this is a little bit of a riff on a typical therapy session which might begin with, what's been going on for you? The SFT therapist is right from the beginning of the hour probing for what's been different and better over the last few days. What have you been doing differently? There's always the expectation in SFT that the client is going to continually work toward positive change. Here are some other questions that support change. What will it be like for you when the problem is solved? What will you be doing instead? When that happens, what difference will it make? Notice that all of these questions are future focused and do not solicit problem talk. How will other people notice that things are better? Who is likely to notice first? What will they see? What else will be different? Again, all of these are problem-free questions that are open-ended. Now, let's look at the specific kinds of questions that are seen in solution-focused therapy. There are a very particular series of questions that are used throughout this intervention that are future-focused and don't solicit problem talk. These are exception, scaling, coping, identity, and strategy questions, and then the tomorrow question, previously known as the miracle question. Let's take a look at these one at a time. Exception questions draw the client's attention from when is the problem not a problem, basically. Tell me about a time when you didn't fill in the blank, when you didn't get angry, when you didn't argue, when you didn't drink. Tell me about a time when the problem wasn't a problem. So notice we're not soliciting problem talk here. Tell me what happens when you drink too much, when you get angry. What are the consequences of that? That's all soliciting problem talk. And SFT does not want you as a therapist to solicit problem talk. So exception questions are a bedrock of that. Tell me about a time when the problem isn't a problem. What was different about that time? This goes back to one of the hallmarks of SFT. If it works, do more of it. So what was different about that time? And we would like the client then to do more of what they were doing when the problem wasn't a problem. When was the most recent time that the problem wasn't a problem? Tell me more about that time in your life. And again, notice the problem-free talk here. Tell me more about the time in your life when the problem wasn't a problem. That's problem-free talk. Here's an example script using nothing but exception questions. Your client says, "Oh, I had a terrible fight with my wife last night. We're arguing all the time." The therapist asks an exception question. When was the most recent time that you felt hopeful about your marriage, when you were getting along better than you do now? And the client says, "Oh, hasn't been good for years." The therapist asks another exception question. "Well, what was different 4 or 5 years ago?" And the client says, "Oh, I don't know. Maybe we just liked each other. We were certainly nicer to each other then." And the therapist asks, "Well, what were you doing then to be nicer to each other that you aren't doing now?" So each of those therapist rejoinders encourage problem-free talk, and they are all examples of exception questions. Now, there's no rule in SFT that you can only ask one type of question in a row. For instance, in this example, there's a series of exception questions, but you might just as easily have asked different kinds of questions as the therapist. You don't have to just ask exception questions or coping questions or scaling questions. You can change them up as the conversation requires. However, this is a good example of 3 exception questions all in a row. Now let's turn our attention to scaling questions. You're probably familiar with scaling questions. They ask the client to rate their current coping or motivation for change or level of confidence or goals on a 1 to 10 scale. The trick to scaling questions in solution-focused therapy is that the scale should focus on strengths. So in other words, instead of asking someone struggling with substance use disorder, "Oh, how worried are you that you're going to relapse?" which is soliciting problem talk, the scale focuses on strengths. How sure are you that you can stay abstinent? So notice that last example. How sure are you that you can stay abstinent? Is positive, does not solicit problem talk, and is a scaling question. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is not at all confident and 10 is very confident, how confident are you in your ability to whatever? And then a follow up question: what would it take for you to move just 1 point higher on the scale? And then another follow up question: what would be the first sign of movement in a positive direction? So these scaling questions build on each other, and notice that the scale is always tilted toward the positive. So 1 is not at all confident, and 10 is very confident, very hopeful, very motivated, whatever scale you're using. Let's look at this in a script. So your client says, "Oh, I had a terrible fight with my wife. We're arguing all the time." The therapist is now going to ask a series of scaling questions. Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 isn't at all motivated and 10 is really motivated, how motivated are you to make positive changes in your marriage? And the client says, maybe a 5, sort of motivated, but I'm not hopeful. And so the therapist follows up. What would it take to move up just 1 point from a 5 to a 6 in terms of your motivation? The client says, "Oh, I don't really know. Maybe I'd be motivated if she was nicer." So the therapist follows up: what would be the first small sign that she was being nicer? So again, we have 3 scaling questions all in a row. Notice that the scale starts with 1, not at all motivated, 10, very motivated, and the scale focuses on problem-free talk. How motivated are you to make positive changes? Note that we are not asking, well, how sure are you that you're going to get divorced? That's problem-free talk, and we don't want to do it. So, how motivated are you to make positive changes in your marriage? Let's move on now to coping questions. These are asked to encourage the client to consider what intrapsychic strengths they have to deal with whatever troubles they're facing. And a key to coping questions is to ask them with unabashed admiration for the client's courage. This is a way of expressing to clients that we think they're pretty remarkable for their perseverance and their stick to itiveness. That's helpful for a client to be asked with a certain amount of awe. Wow, how have you managed to pull that off? So, some examples. The client expresses that they're living, say, with chronic pain, and the therapist asks, how have you managed to cope with that for so long? This encourages the client to think about and articulate their positive inner resources. Another example: how do you manage to cope when things seem so hard? How do you manage to keep going through such demanding situations? These encourage the client to think about what internal skills are they using to get through challenging situations. Let's take a look at this in a script. The client again says, "Oh, that terrible fight with my wife." The therapist now is going to ask a series of coping questions. How have you managed to cope with so much conflict in your marriage? The client says, "I don't know, it's hopeless. Things are never going to get better." The therapist follows up with another coping question. How do you keep going when there seems to be no hope? Again, we're not focusing on the no hope. We're focusing on, wow, look at you're keeping going, even though there seems to be no hope. The client says, "I'm not sure. I guess I just don't want to quit on the marriage." And the therapist affirms that. It sounds like not being a quitter is really important to you. Where did you learn to stick it out in tough situations like this one? Again, notice with every interaction, the therapist is encouraging the client to reflect on their strengths. And in the final example, where might they have gotten some supportive teaching, so that they learn how to use whatever internal resources they're using. Now let's look at identity questions. These questions ask the client to evaluate personal characteristics, right? So, what has enabled you to persevere despite this problem? What strengths are you using to make it through each day? What are some of the skills you use to deal with this problem? Now, here's a script. The client, again, is having just a terrible fight with his wife. And the therapist asks, what strengths do you have in yourself that enable you to deal with so much conflict? The client says, I don't know. If I was stronger, the marriage would probably be better. The therapist reflects, and yet you've managed to persevere despite the difficulties. The client says, well, I guess I'm just not a quitter. The therapist affirms that. Yeah, it seems not. What other skills and strengths have you used to stick with your marriage, even though it's been so tough? So, again, the therapist is asking the client to reflect on the skills that they have, the strengths that they have to persevere through difficulties. Now let's look at strategy questions. These questions are designed to really find solutions. They give solution focused therapy its name. They ask the client to identify specific strategies and solutions that maybe they previously used and they can use now and in the future in order to make positive life changes. So these questions are really operational. They focus on how will you change. So some examples. What steps can you see yourself taking in order to make the problem better? Notice the problem-free talk. We're trying to always work to make the problem not a problem. So what steps can you see yourself taking? And then what's the next thing you can do to achieve your goal? And then how will you know if your strategy is working? All of those strategy questions are positive, focused, and designed to get the client thinking about things they can do differently to make things better. Let's take a look at a script. The client says, oh, such a terrible fight with my wife. The therapist asks some strategy questions now. What's one specific thing you can do that might result in a positive change in your marriage? The client says, I don't know. They don't take the bait. Very often clients will say, I don't know. So client says, I don't know. We're being mean to each other. I don't know how to change it. But the therapist doesn't give up. Notice the first question, what's one thing you can do? The client says, I don't know. So the therapist changes the question very slightly, makes it a little smaller. Instead of asking what one specific thing you can do, the therapist goes a little smaller. So what very small thing might make it better? The client reflects, well, I guess, I could change the way I talk to her in the morning. She says I'm really gruff and it puts her in a bad mood. The therapist says, okay, so what could you do to remind yourself to use a different tone so you seem less gruff? Now, that's an interesting interaction because at first, the client doesn't take our bait when we ask, what's one thing you can do? So when that happens, make your question smaller, reduce the ask until the client is able to come up with an answer. Instead of what's one thing you can do, and the client says, I have no idea, go for, well, what's a very small thing that might make it better? Now, let's look at SFT's most famous question. What used to be known as the miracle question has been rebranded as the tomorrow question. The reason for the rebranding of the miracle question is that miracles are spiritual and they may be alienating to clients who don't have a spiritual orientation or clients whose spiritual orientation does not include miracles. So the tomorrow questions rebranding really had to do with making it a more inclusive question for people who might find the idea of a miracle off-putting. Another practical rationale for changing the miracle question to the tomorrow question is that it suggests that change is possible, as opposed to a client who might think, well, a miracle is not going to happen to me. So turning the miracle question into the tomorrow question is designed to help make the series of questions that you ask more possible. Notice that this is just a rebranding of the title of the tomorrow question. It's actually a series of 3 questions. The questions themselves haven't changed. It's sort of like in the DSM, hypochondriasis was the name of a disorder, and then patients really resented being called hypochondriacs. So the disorder was renamed illness anxiety disorder. It's exactly the same thing. It just got a rebranding. And that's what happened with the miracle question and the tomorrow question. The series of questions that we ask in the tomorrow question are exactly the same as the miracle question. It's just been renamed to make it more inclusive. So, this series of questions asks the client to describe a future that will be different when the problem isn't a problem. So, imagine you woke up tomorrow and all your current difficulties were resolved. What would be the first thing you'd notice? Then the client tells you what they'd notice, and you ask, what else would you notice? What else is the shortest and arguably the most common of all SFT questions. It encourages the client, when they're on a good roll, to keep talking. What else? So the second of the tomorrow question series is, what else would you notice? The client responds, and then after they finish, you ask, how would that make a difference in your life? So be aware that that tomorrow question, imagine if you woke up tomorrow, very often it's used as a solo question. But in actual SFT, this is a series of 3 questions asked in a row. Imagine you woke up tomorrow, all your difficulties were resolved. What would be the first thing you'd notice? What else would you notice? How would that make a difference in your life? Let's look at that in a script. So the client, terrible fight with my wife. The therapist starts the tomorrow question. Imagine that in the middle of the night, something happens and it results in a big change so that when you wake up tomorrow morning, all the troubles in your marriage have been resolved. What would be the first thing you'd notice that would let you know something was really different? The client says, well, maybe I'd be less angry and I'm not sniping at her so much. The therapist asks, what else will you be doing instead of sniping? The client thinks and says, well, maybe I'd rub her back a little maybe and say good morning. The therapist says, and what else would be different? Giving the client time to reflect thoroughly on how else they might make that imagined future a reality. So notice that in each of these example scripts, I've used just exception questions, just coping questions, just strategy questions, and so on. However, let me say again, there's no rule that says you can only ask tomorrow questions or identity questions or strategy questions all in a row. You can mix them up as you need them. However, these questions form the basis of problem-free talk with a future focus. So that's it in a nutshell. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found this helpful, and you'll be able to use these solution-focused therapy skills as you need them. Take good care. Bye-bye.